Live. Three, two, one.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I now call this meeting of the Finance Committee of the Board of Education to order. The time is now 6:35 p.m. Present Chair Joseph Sakalovic, Committee Member Bobby Brown, Committee Member Joseph Lombard, Chairman of the Board John Weldon, Member of the Board of Education Albert Benahan. Also staff present are Ms. Siegel, Ms. Clark, Ms. Mora, and Ms. Flage, and John on the stenographer. And the first item up on the agenda is approval of minutes dated January 15, 2020. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I make a motion to approve the meeting minutes from January 15, 2020.
I will second that. Okay, any discussion or corrections? I was not present, so cannot approve to approve. It's all on you, Ms. Brown.
As of right now, I viewed them, so I don't see any necessary corrections.
So hearing no discussion further than Ms. Brown, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Abstain.
Motion carries. All right, and before we go further, we should state our names before. The way John ran the meeting yesterday, it was a great format, and I think I'm gonna copy that format and use it in my meeting.
Plagiarist.
we listen to the presentations, and then I'll start with committee members for questions, and then followed by the board members afterwards. If that sounds good. And we'll state our names before we speak. Okay, so the next item up on the agenda is an update on the 2019-2020 budget. I believe Ms. Siegel, do you have that, or is that Ms. Clark? Let me do that.
I have that.
And who's speaking, please?
This is Marlene Siegel, Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you. Take it away, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening. With regard to the budget update for 2019-20, first, with regard to the financial condition report, we are in the process of completing the April 30th fiscal forecast for 2019-20. The April 30th financial condition report will be posted in the first week of May. In 2019-20, it is projected that the district is on track to achieve a balanced budget by year end for the 9th consecutive year. It is important to understand that we make projections at any point in time on the basis of current data. There are multiple variables and uncertainties arising from the COVID-19 emergency situation that can impact the fiscal condition. Therefore, we monitor data and trends continuously. In regard to the COVID-19 impact, currently, as we are all aware, schools are closed through May 18th. In view of regional and national news, our projections are based on what we would describe as a worst-case scenario of schools remaining closed until the end of this school year. First, I'm going to discuss debits or shortfalls, followed by credits and savings. So in regard to debits or shortfalls, we are projecting in the area of food and nutrition services a shortfall of $1.7 to $2 million. Now, that is due to reduced meal service and corresponding reduced revenue. It is subject to further analysis of meal service and generated revenue over the coming weeks. Basically, if we're serving approximately 3,500 per meal versus 12 to 13,000, as we were prior to the cancellation of classes, then projected annual revenue is reduced. The staff have been retained in accordance with the governor's order and to ensure a workforce ready to resume normal operations when schools reopen. Food and Nutrition Services has continuing expenses for both personnel and fixed costs, traditionally funded by a full year of optimal revenue based on full-year meal service. Therefore, projected expenditures will exceed projected revenue. This projection does incorporate reserves that had been built in as a contingency. We are awaiting notification from the state as to whether the federal government will send a dedicated revenue stream in excess of actual meals served, or allow us to use certain funding sources in order to assist in compensating for the loss. But if not, then the final shortfall will be covered by the operating budget from credits, which I will discuss next. I also want to indicate before moving on that this is a situation that is existing in most, if not all, districts, and the state is aware of this situation. Now, moving on to credits or savings. In the area of transportation, the superintendent is in negotiations with our primary transportation provider, We Transport, in relation to the governor's order. So therefore, savings cannot be determined this evening. We're hopeful within the next few weeks that we will have a final resolution and a determination of any savings. However, there will be savings in the area of transportation due to the end of services that had been provided by other companies that did not have contracts for special education and homeless situations. In addition, in the area of occasional teacher subs, there will be savings because as of March 13th, when schools were closed, we stopped hiring occasional teacher subs. Long-term subs are continuing. There are also savings in the area of Delta T substitute paras. There are some Delta T nurses working and occupational therapists. However, substitute paras ended as of March 13th. Also, in regard to the pending APSME contract, it has not yet been ratified. In 1920, we had been expecting a ratification and a salary increase retroactive to July 1 of 2019. It appears at this point that the contract may not be ratified until the new year, and so we will accrue the savings in the current year, but we will reserve funds in the new year to make that retroactive payment. In other areas, savings should also occur. For example, overtime, athletics, security, utilities, legal services. However, facilities expenses have increased for supply services and equipment, not all of which are directly related to the COVID-19 situation. And so that increase will absorb a substantial amount of the savings. Nevertheless, we are anticipating a net savings in that area as well. And so we are projecting that we will generate in savings approximately 1.7 million. Could be slightly higher, could be lower, but in that range. And that amount will enable us to have sufficient savings to cover the shortfall in the food and nutrition budget. Beyond reaching a balanced condition, we are hopeful, we're highly optimistic that additional savings will occur in the transportation area and in other areas. Now, I also want to mention and remind everyone that in regard to the Internal Service Fund, in the current year, 2019-20, we had specified with full transparency that we would be utilizing the remainder of the pre-Connecticut partnership or pre-2018-19 surplus in this fund, $2 million, to balance our budget. If a surplus does occur in the operating budget, we will not withdraw the full $2 million, thereby retaining the ISF funds for use in 2021 to help close the budget gap in 2021. I just have one more, I know I've been speaking a long time. I have one more major item to cover. Actually, two more, and then I will stop before we move on to 2021. I want to speak about the CARES Act subgrant. We've received some information about the grant, so I want to describe some of the key elements. However, we do not yet know the amount. So under the federal CARES Act, the states will allocate to school districts subgrants, which may be used for purposes related to the COVID-19 crisis. For example, computer devices for online learning, sanitation supplies and services for cleaning buildings. Another example would be extended day learning. This grant should be released by the end of May, and it will cross 3 fiscal years. The current year, 1920, the next year, 2021, and the following year, 21-22, expiring on September 30th, 2021. And so in the third year, there will only be 3 months in which we'll be able to spend any remaining money. Now, we will utilize the CARES grant as soon as we receive it, and I want to emphasize we expect to receive it in the current fiscal year, and it will have an effective date as of the passage of the legislation. So we will utilize it to fund COVID-related supplies and services in accordance with the guidelines. In addition, the state will require that, in accordance with federal guidelines, that local educational agencies consult with non-public schools regarding the CARES Act, and specifically whether the non-public school would like to participate and how to budget the equitable share. I believe everyone is aware that in our Title I allocation, non-public schools receive a share of those funds, a proportionate share based on eligible students, and the same would be true in this current grant. But the CARES grant will have a much higher degree of flexibility. And finally, I want to continue to reemphasize, as I always do, that the district remains in deficit prevention mode. We continue to implement standard practices for stringent cost management and control. And through deficit prevention mode, we capture accrued funds in all areas and build reserves. And in conclusion, we are optimistic that we will end this year with a surplus condition. Hopefully, we will not have to withdraw the full $2 million from the ISF, and we will build a reserve that can be utilized to close the gap in 2021. Now, I do want to mention before I stop curriculum renewal, which also relates to the work we have been doing in 1920. We are moving forward with curriculum renewal projects for 2021 in the area of literacy. In April, current month, we have placed orders with McGraw-Hill for the grade 4, 5, 6 Reading Wonders program, a 6-year plan, building on the K-3 platform that was introduced in 2019-20. And this program had been approved by the board in the spring of 2019 for grades K-6. So we already had board approval, and that's why we were able to move forward. The cost is over $1 million. We have used 5 fund sources, all grant fund sources, and the print materials will be held by the company until principals are in their schools ready to receive the cartons. In the area of mathematics, a proposal for the math program, grades 6, 7, 8, will be presented to the board for approval, I hope, this month in April. And then the program will be split funded across the current year, 1920, and the new year, again, using grants. We fund the professional development components in both literacy and math in Title IIA, and the balance across other grants. And we will most likely use the CARES grant for the digital components, which apply to online learning in these initiatives. And the cost of the math program that will be presented to the board is $794,846. It's a 6-year program and includes replenishment of the student workbooks in each of those years. And that concludes the report on 1920.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Siegel. I got not too many questions on the prior year, but just a couple. You mentioned that there are some facilities costs that increase that are unrelated to COVID. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, the overtime costs we had determined when we did the analysis in March were in excess of the needs based on vacancies. So there had been some emergency situations and other types of critical situations that apparently required overtime. In addition, we had previously made reductions in the facilities budget, if you recall, in 18-19 that we had carried forward into 19-20. And so I believe there were certain maintenance needs and equipment replacement needs that could not be met in 18-19, and so the need has now arisen for those needs, for those items to be provided in 19-20, and we want to plan ahead into 2021 to make certain that we have sufficient reserves to manage those needs. They may have to buy, to give you a specific example, a floor waxer. They may need a new piece of equipment. It's not a major piece of equipment, and therefore it's not funded by the city capital fund.
Right.
But nevertheless, it should be purchased in order to replace outmoded equipment or old equipment that isn't functioning.
All right, just let me back up to a question about the overtime. That's non-COVID related. During that time, I'm looking for creative counting here, maybe. During the time that people were performing overtime, were there people engaged in COVID cleanups or activities that could have been redeployed to cover the overtime costs, thereby maybe being able to put these overtime costs into COVID? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes. So the facilities department has been asked to code all COVID-related expenses as COVID, and we will be tabulating all of those expenses. Any expenses that qualify for FEMA reimbursement will be submitted with the FEMA application. I don't have exact data for you. I can simply say that we know that expenses have been coded as, if they were COVID related, they were to be coded as such, and the facilities has been reminded to do that.
Yeah, we gotta try to get every penny on every pencil.
Absolutely.
Right, what else was was I ready to ask? Curriculum renewal. The grants, as far as the grants,
Mhm.
I see an explosion of grants. Are we prepared to apply for all the grants? Are we properly staffed enough that we're not going to miss out on any major grants in the finance department? Because I know you guys are stretched thin already.
The CARES grant will be a formula grant. It will come to the district automatically. The state has to apply for the grant to the federal government. The communication we received yesterday from the state, from Kathy Dempsey, indicated that the application is not yet ready. She expected that the federal application would be available hopefully within the next week. But it is the state that applies to the federal government. We presume that the federal government will definitely release the funds. It's our understanding that the state, by law, may retain up to 10% for state projects. They must allocate to the districts a minimum of 90%, and they have to use the Title I methodology.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Siegel. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Bobby Brown. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I know that Ms. Siegel mentioned that there was a lot of saving that was done with all of the things that we had going on. So I want to know, is there a number to the savings that we have accumulated since COVID-19 or during COVID-19?
Yes, I believe I mentioned that in the various areas, which I'll enumerate once more in a moment, that we were anticipating a net positive impact of about 1.7 million.
Okay.
In summary, we wanted to make certain that we could cover the shortfall in food and nutrition. This is a projection, as I said, it's based on current data. It could be slightly lower or it could be higher. But that includes the savings in transportation that we can quantify at this time with some degree of accuracy, as well as the savings in occasional teacher subs, Delta T substitute paras, the reserve that we had for the APSME contract, and other areas combined. So I mentioned now, I mentioned overtime because after March 12th, which was the last day schools were in session, the superintendent directed that there not be any more overtime in the facilities area or security area without his prior approval, on the premise that schools were now closed and most activities should be conducted during the day. Nevertheless, there can still be some emergencies after the end of the regular workday. So the amount of overtime post March 12th is very low, extremely low in comparison to the prior period. So that is why I mentioned overtime. But as we look ahead to 2021, we're looking at the trends that existed prior to the closure of schools, and we're examining strategies that can be recommended to the superintendent to further control overtime. And I also mentioned athletics, security, and utilities. We think, although we cannot be certain, absolutely certain at this moment, but we think that there should be some savings in utilities because classes are not in session, so presumably lights are not on in classrooms, certainly not at all times. And so we're hopeful that we will see some savings in the electricity area and in the other utility areas. So at this point, with areas where we can quantify and make initial projections in which we have a high degree of confidence, we are projecting approximately 1.7 million.
Okay. I had put the 1.7 down, but I wasn't sure if it was directly for the overhaul cost of like savings altogether. But thank you for clarifying that. And then my last question would be, I know that you mentioned, I'm not too familiar with the CARES Act. However, I know that you mentioned like electronics. So the CARES Act wouldn't be able to support the food nutrition services, just electronics.
Well, in food and nutrition, the main factor is reduced revenue. And the personnel cost. Now,
Okay.
usually the federal government does not allow one federal source to use for reimbursement of funds for a purpose that's already funded by a federal grant.
Okay.
Food and Nutrition Services is funded solely by federal and state revenue, and in fact, it's primarily federal revenue. The issue causing the shortfall is reduced revenue in comparison with total cost and the obligation we have to fulfill the governor's order and maintain the staff on payroll in order to have a workforce ready to resume operations when schools reopen. Having said that, we do intend to ask that question. So we will ask
Okay.
the state, once we receive the actual grant and the dollar amount, we will ask that question, which is, are we allowed to fund hourly cafeteria assistants, for example, using the CARES Act? Are we allowed to submit for their services through the FEMA reimbursement? And by the way, we have yet to receive the specific guidelines for FEMA reimbursement. I hope to have those guidelines Friday afternoon. There will be a video meeting conducted by the state on the, we believe it will focus on the FEMA reimbursement application and guidelines.
That definitely makes sense, and that's why I asked it, because I was like, if we're going to receive funds, and it would be nice to see what services we can actually help and support that are still up and running. Because I know that we are also feeding students, I believe, if I could be wrong, but we're feeding them over the April break, and then possibly, I think conversation came about that we'll be feeding them even during the summer a little bit. I could be wrong, but I think that was something that the superintendent brought up. So I just want to make sure if we're going to be able to provide those services, that we actually are able to help support those, our workers that are actually in the schools, providing those services with whatever additional funds we may come across to keep those things running. Because we don't know what it's going to look like. And I think food services is super important. I think we all agree that. But I also want to make sure that we're able to continue that work with whatever additional funds we may find. Thank you for answering it.
Yes, in regard to the summer, first of all, we're awaiting further guidance from the state in regard to summer programs and summer feeding. In the past, we always operated summer feeding sites. So we would expect summer feeding sites to continue, and the exact number of the sites will be determined at a later point. That's the best information we have at this time. Now, in regard to the April recess week, current week, yes, we have been serving meals, and in the projection that I mentioned, I included a projection for the revenue that we are generating, that we have been generating since March 13th. As I indicated, the revenue is extremely reduced in comparison to higher revenue or revenue that we would generate on a typical school day. So we are continuing to provide the meal service. We are continuing to conduct fiscal analysis, as we always do. And as a result of that analysis, we will revise our projections accordingly. At this point, we are anticipating a shortfall of between 1.7 and 2. Hopefully, it will be at the lower level.
Thank you.
Yes,
welcome.
okay. Yeah, before I move to somebody else, I just got a follow-up question about Ms. Brown. I just want to clarify that our expenses due to the executive order are fixed, and the meals we serve, every additional meal we serve will help defer those expenses. Correct?
Are you asking me the
Yes,
question?
ma'am. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So the more meals you serve, the better.
Exactly. The higher the number of meals served, the higher the profit, or the higher the revenue, and the higher the profit, which funds the staff.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
That is correct.
All right. Mr. Lombard. Any questions, Mr. Lombard?
No, I don't have any questions. I just wanted to comment, Ms. Siegel, the very clear and thorough presentation, especially in this format. So thank you for that. Thank you, Seb.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
Mr. Weldon?
No, nothing from me.
Mr. Benahan? Mr. Benahan, you still
Yes,
here?
I have a question. Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry.
I have something to say. First of all, I just want to know, Ms. Siegel, it's not because I never receive it. The package, when we all together, you always give a package to us, but we don't receive that email about all your package. Everything was reading. You always break down everything, all the information.
I give a report on the current year fiscal condition. I have never distributed a document with the report. I have distributed at prior meetings data charts, such as special ed data, as an example, or the budget history charts as another example. For this meeting, Superintendent and I determined that it is not necessary to have any written documents, and the reason for that is that we are in an emergency situation. There are many uncertainties and variables that we have to confront. In addition, the City Council, which I'm going to discuss next, is currently reviewing the mayor's budget for 2021. And our role is to advocate for the funding that we have requested from the city as well as from the state. On the state side, the state has not yet passed a budget for 2021. And our budget gap plan is going to be dependent on the revenue that we ultimately receive. It will be dependent on the end-of-year condition in 1920, which I just described to you, and obviously it's fluid due to the various variables and uncertainties that are impacting on the condition. We do believe that ultimately those variables are going to impact positively. That is our belief today. And so it is best at this point in time, while the City Council is reviewing the city budget, inclusive of the Board of Education share, and the state is reviewing their budget, inclusive of state ECS allocations districts. It is best that we have a discussion and not have printed materials.
Okay, Ms. Siegel, thank you. I appreciate your amazing job and your amazing work. Also, so far, you don't know how much we're saving, because the school's closing, how much far we got saving, because all the budget, the situation we're going through.
Well, I indicated that the savings in the specific areas that I enumerated, we are projecting will total approximately $1.7 million. That's an initial projection. As you know, we are always conservative in our projections. It is better to underestimate than to overestimate. So hopefully that number will be higher. And the superintendent is in negotiations with the primary transportation company. And once those negotiations have been completed, we'll be able to project any additional savings in the transportation area. And as we continue through this fiscal year, we will continue to conduct our fiscal analysis as we have always done.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel. I appreciate your amazing information. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, I think I got to everybody. Does anybody have any other further questions before we move on to the next agenda item? Hearing none. Next up on the agenda is an update on the 2021 budget status. Ms. Siegel, take it away again, please.
Thank you. So in regard to the 2021 budget request, first, on January 27, 2020, the board approved the budget request of $14.5 million as the essential monetary need to maintain services and fulfill mandates. In regard to the city share, the mayor has included an increase of $2 million to the MBR in the 2021 budget submitted to the City Council. In addition to the $2 million, which is in the budget request, and that is very good news, the superintendent has requested that the city provide additional resources as follows. First, $1.4 million in direct payment to the transportation company as in 1920 to enable continuation of the transportation limits. Now, the $1.4 million in the current year consisted of $1.2 million in a direct payment and a $200,000 credit from the company. In addition, the superintendent has asked for a waiver of the one-time payment that was to be due in 2021 to maintain the 9 SROs after expiration of the COPS grant on June 30th of 2020. And that amount, you will recall, was in the PowerPoint for the budget request, and that was $434,753. Therefore, if all of these requests are approved, the city's share will be approximately $3.8 million. And that is what we are advocating for, and that is the number that we would expect. Moving on to the state. With regard to state ECS, the 2019 state legislative report indicated the expectation of approximately $2.8 million for Bridgeport in 2021. However, the governor's proposed budget specified 2.3, which was lower by $500,000, and that's quite a significant difference. We are remaining optimistic that the final ECS increase in the state budget will be a minimum of $2.8 million. We're hopeful it will be at least $2.8 million, and perhaps it will be higher. Right? So if the state share comes in at 2.8, let's round that for discussion purposes to $3 million. And if the city share comes in at 3.8, let's round that to 4 for simplicity in the discussion. We would have close to $7 million in revenue toward our monetary need. Now, in relation to the monetary need, I want to come back to that number, that $14.5 million, and I want to share with the board some new developments. First of all, the projected need is going to remain stable at this time, despite the developments I'm going to mention, and that's because there are some positive elements and there are some negative elements. Now, first, in regard to health insurance, the growth rate for the Connecticut Partnership Health Insurance Plan is expected to be in the 6.5 to 7% range. Now, that's lower than the original projection provided to us by the health consulting firm of 10%. So that's good news. However, we have not yet received the premium rates. And until I see premium rates that reflect a lower percentage growth, I'm not ready to make any definitive changes. Nevertheless, I've examined that change in relation to other factors in anticipation that it will be in that range. Next, I've spoken with the board previously about the MERS rate, M-E-R-S. That is the Municipal Retirement Fund for non-certified staff. And for every non-certified full-time staff member, we are required to contribute to the fund. The rate has been increasing by about 2% in every year. It had been announced previously that it would go up by 2% over a 5-year period, and 2% per year over a 5-year period. And so on the negative side, the MERS rate for next year will be 16.39%, which is slightly higher than the originally anticipated rate of 16.25. Now, that's a minor difference, but it does result in an increased cost in the operating budget projected at about $50,000. In the area of facilities, I mentioned earlier that we're re-examining our projections in the area of facilities because we're discovering that even when we make reductions, it's frequently not possible to operate within certain limits due to various factors. And so we're re-examining the expenses in that area for maintenance, supplies, services, and overtime on a full year basis. And we're working collaboratively, of course, with our facilities team on strategies that can be used to reduce and control costs. I mentioned the APSME contract previously, and so in 2021, we'll have to reserve funds for a retroactive payment. We're assuming that there will be a salary increase approved retro to 7/1/19. And so, as I indicated, the projected need of 14.5 remains stable at this time. I have examined the impact of the various factors that I mentioned, and so I'm pleased that I don't have to increase it, and we're going to, at this point, work towards achieving that number. And in the annual reassessment process that we conduct in the May to August period, we will analyze state and city revenue and updated projections in all areas in order to determine the 2021 condition. Then we'll revise a plan to close the gap and aim to ensure a structurally balanced budget for the new year. I do want to note that based upon the news reports that I've been reading, it's my understanding that the state is delayed in approving a budget as a result of the COVID-19 disruption. And I believe I read recently that the state gave municipalities an extended time frame. Whether or not that will have an impact on the passage of Bridgeport's budget, we don't know at this point. But I'm mentioning this information because it's possible that the state will be delayed in its budget process. So when I speak about the May to August period, that's the traditional time frame. If the state doesn't pass a budget until May 20th or June 1st, then our complete analysis will also be delayed. But obviously, we will work with the data we have, and we will work to incorporate contingencies. Now, I know you're wondering about the budget gap plan. What is the plan if we should fall short? How do we achieve $14.5 million? Well, we are going to implement some major strategies that we have used in the past that have, we expect, zero impact on school operations. And we believe that with city and state revenue combined, and hopefully with some surplus funds from 1920, combined with the strategies I'm going to mention, that we will be able to achieve a balanced budget for the new year 2021. So I'm going to mention briefly 9 strategies. First, you have heard me speak repetitively about deficit prevention mode. One key element of deficit prevention mode is realizing accruals from vacant positions that are filled by substitute personnel when we have a lack of certified or qualified candidates. I want to emphasize this happens naturally when there is a lack of certified or qualified candidates. I do not know today how many teacher vacancies we're going to have in September. However, based on prior experience, the historical trend and continuing shortages of teachers nationwide, particularly in shortage areas, we think it's safe to forecast savings of approximately $2 million from all vacant positions filled by substitute personnel. That would include teachers and paraprofessional lines as well. And I want to emphasize, whenever I cite a number, it's a projection. It can be higher or it can be lower. Next, position consolidation. Well, that's simply the annual process that we conduct to adjust positions in alignment with projected registers. At this point, we've completed the projection of registers. I've completed 38 allocation conferences by webinar with principals, and the current net change in teacher positions is 2, -2 teacher positions as a result of changes in registers. Next, we have vacant position conversions. What do we mean? For example, a 12-month AP vacancy occurs due to attrition. Perhaps someone retires or someone is promoted to a principal position through the selection process. That 12-month AP position will be converted to a 10-month position as per board policy. The savings, approximately $25,000 per position. Number 4, program reorganization and adjustments. What does that mean? For example, the district assessment program is not going to be continued in its prior form. There will be savings of about $136,000. So that is one example of what we mean by a program adjustment. Number 5, curriculum renewal funds. Temporary redeployment of those funds to balance the budget. This is intended to be temporary when it happens, pending fiscal assessments of accrued funds. I've used this strategy in multiple years. Fortunately, it has always worked well, and we have been able to reallocate the funds and continue with our curriculum renewal cycle. Is it guaranteed when we do this that it will be temporary? No, I can never offer guarantees, but I can say that based on prior experience, it's a good strategy to use if necessary. Number 6, summer programs. Due to the COVID-19 situation, it is possible that summer programs that traditionally operated at school sites will operate online. I want to emphasize we do not know what the decision of the state will be at this point, but it is possible considering the nature of the emergency situation. In the case of summer ESY, which is extended school year for special education, if that program were to operate online instead of at school sites, there would be a definite savings in transportation. And that is approximately $600,000 for the summer alone. Number 7, the CARES Act subgrant. So we've spoken considerably tonight about the CARES Act subgrant. We are going to transfer appropriate charges from the operating budget that took place after the passage of the CARES Act that are COVID-related, are in compliance with the CARES Act guidelines, to the grant. For example, today I viewed 3 orders placed by the Facilities Department for face masks. The total of these 3 orders was $8,000. Now, we're going to determine, we know that they will qualify under the CARES Act. We're going to determine whether they qualify under FEMA as well. I don't think they will qualify in both places, as I mentioned earlier. Usually the federal government, when they have 2 parallel grants, they structure the guidelines in a way that precludes the same types of items being charged to both. But my point is, we are going to maximize the opportunity to seek reimbursement from these grants. So number 8 is actually FEMA reimbursement. And we mentioned earlier that we will apply for the reimbursement for overtime and other expenses related to COVID-19 under the guidelines. Now, it's important to also understand that for FEMA reimbursement, based on our prior experience after Hurricane Sandy, there was usually a lag of about a year after submission of the application for the reimbursement. Now, it's possible that the federal government is operating in a more efficient manner currently, but we don't know. And so it's important to understand that when we identify the eligible expenses for FEMA reimbursement, we file that application, let's assume that it's filed in June or even July, we may not receive reimbursement until the subsequent fiscal year. So it may not assist in balancing a budget in the year in which the application is filed. And finally, number 9 is other grants. We can discuss the state magnet grant, which is for Discovery and Fairchild Wheeler. We're going to be assessing the projected enrollment for 2021, which, if higher, will generate additional revenue. I believe you'll recall that in 1920, current year, we had a loss in comparison with the prior year of about $550,000 due to much lower enrollment. Now, we're hopeful that the enrollment has stabilized and will grow. Hopefully it won't decline. And so if the enrollment grows, we should have some additional revenue. And also in the grants area, we roll money each year in the grants that have rollover components. For example, Title I. Why do we do that? We do that because we need to have funding in the subsequent year to cover escalated costs. Our grants in Title I and Title II, Title III, these are substantial grants. Also, IDEA is another substantial grant. And so if we didn't do that, our monetary need in the operating budget would be higher. In order to keep it at a lower level, we roll money in those grants, and therefore we have the funds to cover the escalated costs. Now, we roll more than we need for the escalated costs because we need to have a cushion, and we need to have what I call a rolling cushion that can roll into the next year and be larger than the level at which it starts, so that the ultimate cushion, when it ultimately rolls into the next year, is high enough to cover not only the escalated costs, but to provide some additional resources that can then roll into the subsequent year. So that's why it's called a rolling cushion. It continues to roll, and it maintains stability of the grant. we may be able to utilize a portion of the amount in excess of the amount needed for the escalated costs, if necessary, in order to balance the budget. However, depending on the amount, that type of action could negatively impact the stability of the grant in the subsequent year because there may not be enough funds for the escalated costs, and that in turn would increase the monetary need, as I explained. Nevertheless, it is an option that we have to strive to balance the budget without undertaking any more reduction in positions, programs, or services. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Guy, I got quite a few comments and questions. All right. First of all, I'm concerned with this $1.2 million, as we discussed last year, for transportation costs not being rolled into the MBR, which some of us believed was illegal. I don't know if we further explored that, but it's concerning because if we end up with a deficit after and accept that money, that means one of our largest expenditures, we're tying our hands with making cuts too, possibly. And that's just one comment. And best case scenario that you laid out on the revenue side between the state and the city is a $6.6 million increase, and which will leave us a $7.9 million gap with the rest of this plan to cover. And these are all not guaranteed. They're all projections. As you said, they could always change. I'm concerned with last budget cycle and cycles before it. When we get in front of the city council and we get in front of the mayor and cuts have to be made, it's always nobody communicated that need to us. And as we know, we have communicated the need over and over again that we're in dire straits. Every cut at this point that we have to make impacts the classroom. There's nothing we could take away anymore that doesn't impact the kids in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's delayed curriculum renewal, we got old textbooks. Whether it's whatever happens, summer programs online instead of in person, which is not going to be a cut, which may be just a consequence of COVID and what have you. And it's just very concerning to me that I'm still seeing a $7.9 million gap, and it seems like much of it could be covered in the best case scenarios, but we also got to look out for the worst case scenarios as well and have some backup plans for those worst case scenarios. Should we need to make some cuts to balance this budget for what year in a row would it be? The 11th year? Right?
10th year next year.
10th year would be next year. So the 10th, because I think we are legally obligated to balance the budget. Okay, now on to some of the questions that I had was actually just basically after my comments, I got all right, the summer programs and the possibilities on. Have we explored any more of Lighthouse rental fees and having them pay an appropriate share? Because I'm sure Lighthouse will be getting additional grants as well.
We have not. I would suggest that you speak with the superintendent about that item.
Okay. Superintendent. Okay, so Lighthouse. Okay, and also the magnet grants. You mentioned the magnet schools and enrollment, and we've gone down. One of the significant reasons we've gone down was the tuition charges leading to schools the districts not allowing us to recruit in their districts. And there was an accompanying lawsuit with bills that remain unpaid from our surrounding districts for the magnet tuition. Has there been any movement on recouping those monies?
The lawsuit is still pending. I didn't mention it because it's still pending. Clearly, we hope that we will prevail in the end, and that the 4 districts that have to date refused to pay will be required to pay. the amounts past due as well as the amount due for the year in which the lawsuit is settled. However, the lawsuits are still pending. Therefore, at this moment in time, we are not including past tuition payments in our plan.
And what about payments to outside districts that owe us money? I understand we weren't paying some of those because, like, I can't remember what school it was, like the farm school in Trumbull or something.
Yes.
So in Trumbull, Trumbull has the agri-science school, and so we do not pay Trumbull tuition for agri-science since they do not pay Bridgeport magnet tuition.
And is that lack of payment built into the budget, or is it washed out with the
It balances.
balances?
In other words, the we keep a running account of the amounts that they owe us and the amounts we owe them. And as of the end of last year and mid-year, when I looked at the balance sheet, I believe they owed us a certain amount. It was a relatively low amount. And so when we speak of the amount due in tuition on an annual tuition payments annual basis from those 4 districts, hypothetically, if the number is approximately 1.2, I believe it's actually lower now due to lower enrollment, but just for simplicity, if it's 1.2, and the amount due from, let's say the amount from Trumbull is $300,000, hypothetically, then we are actually need only the $900,000 because we've already we have refused to pay for agri-science.
Right.
So,
All right. Okay. One for the city council is meeting on the Board of Education budget on April 22nd, correct?
yes.
And I'm sure you're going to be there, and we're putting our best foot forward to try to get us as much money as possible, so we don't have to go into any of these contingencies. And
Yes.
and also followed by that, and I'll take this opportunity to say I think it's the 23rd that's going to be the public hearings on the Board of Education budget. Do we have any
The
updated
superintendent.
talking points?
Well, the superintendent speaks at the public hearing, so you would need to speak with him about his plans for his presentation at the public hearing. I believe last year the superintendent at the time formed a team with various board members and spoke, and I believe certain board members also spoke.
Right. Yes, I spoke as well. I know it's just going to look a lot differently in the electronic version, and hopefully we can get enough members of the public to call in and be activated as they were in other years, because our strength is in our numbers to get our numbers. Okay, that's all I have for you, Ms. Siegel. I'm going to pass it on to Mr. Joseph Lombard. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Not really questions. I understand what was presented. The only thing I wasn't very clear on is when you talked about, for example, the FEMA reimbursement, where the funds themselves may not appear until a year later, and you said so it wouldn't be part of that prior year's budget. I wasn't clear on that, because if you could kind of talk about that as far as where it appears in the budget, since we wouldn't know when the funds would come. But also just, and then the other thing was just more of a comment, similar, well, two comments. One is similar to what Mr. Sokolovich was saying, that these strategies for deficit reduction, they're very promising. And, of course, they do include, they are reductions in some respects, from a 12-month position to a 10-month position. So, so in that respect, it is a reduction, so it's not a positive thing. But my other comment is that this is a positive report. I mean, to hear that with the projections, all projections, both on income, revenue, and savings, that we would be able to balance without any major impact to the operations in the classroom and the administration. It's very, 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 very encouraging. So this is good
Yes.
news. But again, if you understood my question, I'm not sure if you did or not, what I was
Yes.
saying about.
Yes. So let's take an example, and let's suppose that we're told that we can file a FEMA application in June. Well, if we file in June, it's not likely that the government is going to act on it and approve the reimbursement stream until the 2021 fiscal year. So if we have expended, hypothetically, let's say $25,000 on various types of COVID-related overtime in 1920, we may not receive the reimbursement until 2021. Meanwhile, we have to close the 1920 year in balance. So we have to cover that cost in our budget through our available revenue in the subsequent year. $25,000, if fully approved by the federal government, would then flow into the 2021 budget and be used to offset expense in that year.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Bobby Brown? Ms. Brown?
I have no real. Yeah, I'm here. Sorry,
Okay,
I was trying to.
No worries, no worries.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel, for your presentation. I agree with Mr. Lombard. This is actually interesting news, but also news that we can work with moving forward with the Board of Education, and a lot of things that we may also need to make the public aware of as to why these things are actually taking place and how they can play a role into bettering, understanding of what's the next steps for our students and also for the fiscal year and the budget for everyone that's involved. But also too, I was with you, Mr. Lombard. I was trying to understand that question as well, but it kind of makes sense because I'm more trying to make sure that if we do receive those particular funds, how will they be able to be used? I guess in the future, because we wouldn't be able to use them right now, correct? If we don't get them right now?
Well, in my example, if we have $25,000 in COVID-related overtime, we've already had that expense, and we've covered that expense, and we've built that expense into our budget plan, and we know that we have to cover that expense in order to balance. The reimbursement would come in the following year. Once that reimbursement is deposited in our budget, it's going to result in an additional $25,000 that's available to the district. It's part of the budget. It can be used to offset other types of expenses. It might be used to cover a new need. It might be used to cover basic operating expenses. So the actual use will depend on the budget plan and the conditions at the time.
So it won't negatively affect us. I guess that's
we're not in
question.
Any negative impact at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Benahan?
I'm here, sorry.
No
Thank
worries.
you. Thank you. Yes, I have a question, Ms. Siegel. Why
Yes.
we do continue to comfortable with the hiring substitute teacher to fill out full-time permanent teacher position? Because we have teachers, they have experience, and I believe we have the money for them.
Yeah, there's an extensive teacher recruitment program. There is a nationwide teacher shortage that, to the best of my knowledge, still exists. And there are continuing shortages in the areas of math, science, special education, and foreign languages, bilingual, and ESL education. Now, every effort is made by our principals and by our Human Resources Office to recruit qualified teachers to fill teacher vacancies. Every teacher must be certified. And so we have to identify for each vacancy a teacher who has the proper certification in that area. Otherwise, we cannot hire that teacher. As a result of the shortages that exist, historically, this district has always opened the school year with a number of vacancies. Now, I can recall in one year, the starting number was rather low. It was approximately 10 vacancies, which is an outstanding result of a recruitment effort considering the size of the district and the size of the teaching force. That number, of course, as I mentioned previously, grows over the course of several months as attrition occurs in the school year. But last year, meaning 18-19, I believe we opened with I think it was around 20, and in 19-20 we opened at a higher level. Now, so looking at the 3-year average and understanding that shortages continue, I'm anticipating that we will open the new school year with a number of vacancies. So as I mentioned, this is a naturally occurring condition. And so no one wants this to happen. Everyone is striving to fill vacancies. The reality is that we can reasonably project that there will be a certain level of vacancies. And so when it comes time to balance a budget, we take into account the reality. And that reality produces savings. Now, if every position were filled, then we wouldn't have those savings. And we would have to re-examine our options for closing a gap. So I want to emphasize before closing that this is a naturally occurring condition. Everyone is striving to fill the positions. Unfortunately, due to the shortages that exist in the teaching profession, it is highly likely that there will be a number of vacancies in this district. Once again, I cannot predict the exact number. I can't predict the starting number or the number in December of 2020 or in February of 2021 at this point. But we do know that in 1920, we have a relatively high number of vacancies.
All right, thank you, Ms. Siegel. I appreciate your amazing report.
Yeah, I just got a comment before I move on to Mr. Weldon. Those vacancies, we're competing for scarce resources, and
That's right.
we're not paying a premium. If we were to pay a premium, those resources would be less scarce. Unfortunately, our financial situation does not allow us to pay that premium to our teachers, so we get what we get. Mr. Weldon?
The only thing I have to say is that I appreciate the information Ms. Siegel has given us. We go through this every year. There's a lot of balls in the air, particularly this year, a lot of unknowns, and it's a constantly moving target. And I appreciate the work that Ms. Siegel is doing in following that target and constantly readjusting so that we can hone in on the balanced budget. The only other thing I would expand on that Ms. Siegel talked about with the FEMA stimulus money and the CARES stimulus money, I have some experience with this with the former American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. ARA money that the Obama administration initiated 10 or so years ago. And the way these kinds of programs work is because they're so unique. When you make submissions for reimbursement to them, they typically get scrutinized more closely than other subsidy programs that are more common and day-to-day operations related. So that's why there's a greater lag time in actually seeing the money come back to you. They typically ask for a lot more information than they do in other programs. So it's an arduous thing to seek reimbursement under these special stimulus packages. But eventually the money does come and it becomes worth it. So it's not that anybody's dragging their feet. It's just the nature of the type of program that it is.
Right.
But I'm glad that Ms. Siegel and Mr. Testani are actively seeking these funds, because while it may be a bit of a strain on us in the present, it's going to yield benefits this time next year. So I appreciate that effort. And that's all I have to say.
Yes, absolutely. I did want to mention Mr. Sokolovic and acknowledge that there are 3 members of the finance team on this call. Liz Maurer, who's the manager of budget and financial reporting, Nadira Clark, director of grants development and management, and John Garrity, director of food and nutrition services. And I want to thank them for their time on this call and the excellent work that they do as part of our team, because we work collaboratively toward the goal of fiscal responsibility and fiscal integrity. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Before we go, I got one question, kind of a minor question, but it's a very little dollar amount, but they're very impactful. Our Title I funding for our parents and our parent convention and all that stuff, how is that money being redirected? And is there any way we could use it to get better contacts with our parents if it's not gone?
The Title I, there's the Title I parent involvement allocation for the schools.
Correct.
And the schools have until May 1st to submit all of their orders. Originally, the due date was April 1st, and it was extended to May 1st. That is an absolute deadline. There will be no exceptions, because we have to move to the closeout process for the fiscal year. So those funds that were allocated to the schools belong to the schools. Nadira can address the status of the reports that we've been generating. As far as the parent convention, we did have $9,000 set aside for the convention. If the convention doesn't happen, I'm assuming it's not happening,
Right.
we're going to roll that money into the new year. If there's an activity that you want to, you would propose to engage in, I would suggest you speak to the superintendent.
Right. Yeah, because I was thinking that money's going to lay foul. It's got to be used for parent engagement activities, education, and such things like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that might be a conversation we could have at students and families when they meet, and maybe
Yes.
we could have a discussion about that and where we want to go with that. But that money's not going to evaporate, correct?
We're going to roll it into the new year, and as part of the CARES Act, the states have the option of applying for a waiver of the 15% limit on rollover. We are not aware at this time whether or not our state has applied for that rollover. Hopefully they will. That would give us even greater flexibility in being able to roll additional funds into the new year if we have a higher rollover condition than anticipated.
Okay, now, Ms. Siegel, I'd like your opinion now. You said we got a moving target, right? And it's going to be constantly shifting. Do you think it would be best to have the board meet a little more often on a budget so we could digest it in little bites rather than larger bites? Because I think some of us might do better with.
No, I think that we have to wait until the city passes a budget and the state passes a budget before another meeting is scheduled.
Okay, so we figure monthly would be good.
At least one more month. Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. That's all. Thank you very much. It was very, very informative. and very well presented. I'd like to thank you and your staff. And I think the next item, number 5, we've already covered the COVID impact. And thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe. I'll take a motion to adjourn right now.
Make a motion to,
Motion to adjourn.
second,
Made by Ms. Brown, seconded by Mr. Lombard. All in favor?
aye.
Aye. Opposed? No.
Aye.
Motion carries. Everybody, please stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll meet again. Tomorrow will be a teaching and learning committee for anybody interested in attending who's not on the committee. You're more than welcome, and I definitely welcome you to come. Thank you.
Take
very
care, everyone. God bless you all.
Goodbye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Multiple people are now exiting.